Good morning, everyone. Professor Bradley Williams, our guest speaker, respected Professor Amog Rai, and my fellow colleagues. Today, we are here for another episode of Asia SenseMaker. In Asia SenseMaker, we have informal conversations, yet they maintain a level of depth and expertise comparable to a seminar setting. Today, we have with us Professor Bradley Rowland Williams. Professor Williams is an associate professor and associate head at Department of Public and International Affairs, City University, Hong Kong. Professor Williams is an expert in East Asian international relations and comparative politics with a particular focus on Japan. Much of his earlier work examined the various roles of subnational governments as international actors and their impact on foreign policy. He has also published on a diverse range of issues in Japanese politics and foreign policy, such as arms procurement, civil society, humanitarian assistance, human security, North Korean abductions, nuclear prolifications, and secrecies laws. We welcome you, Professor Brad. Today, Thank you. Today, we'll have a discussion around his latest book, Japanese Foreign Intelligence and Grand Strategy from the Cold War to the Abe Era, published in the year 2021. This book delves into the Japanese foreign intelligence institutions, practices, and capabilities across the economic, political, and military domains. Now, I would request the moderator for today, Professor Amog Rai. He is the Director of Research at Advanced Study Institute of Asia. Sir, I would now request you to kindly open the session.
Thank you, Neeti. Thank you so much for introducing Professor Williams. Professor Williams, welcome to Asia. Now, with your permission, although you are an Australian, as you just said, and informal, but we'd still like to have your permission to open the session.
Sure.
All right, thank you. So, I'm going to jump right into it. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of question and answers. I've seen that you've done presentations around the book where you have given a lecture and they've been very informative. I watched one or two of them.
Okay.
But most of them came out right around the time that the book came out. And I would do you a disservice. I'm actually going to kind of drag the book into 2023, right? And if at any point of time you think that this is going out of the book's context, you are free to tell me that that's all right and we can go ahead with it.
Sure.
When the book was being written, Shinzo Abe still existed as a person. Now he exists as an idea of, a Japan which is resurgent. What has changed in the last 2 years in the Abe doctrine or the Abe doctrine that everybody talked about? But you've just seen the new Japanese budget come out. And for the first time since the Second World War, the defense budget has really gone up. So what changed in the last 2 years vis-a-vis grand strategy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would argue that we're seeing a continuation. So obviously we have Abe's obviously not in power, but his spirit continues. So this doctrine is still being maintained by his successor, currently, Prime Minister Kishida. But you said that you mentioned the defense budget, and in fact, that has increased, and it increased every year since 2012. That was Abe's, second stint at the prime ministership. So it did increase every year, and it has done so since that period of time. But what makes that interesting is that for the previous 20 years, roughly, Japanese defense expenditure had really stagnated. And this certainly stands out in comparison, say, to neighboring China, for instance, which has experienced double-digit budget increases for the military since the early 1990s. But so we're seeing this record defense expenditure, which you alluded to, and there is some misunderstandings or misperceptions about the degree. It is substantial, but some people have been arguing because the goal is by 2027 to increase defence spending from the current approximately 1% of GDP to 2%. So people are automatically assuming that Japan's defence expenditure will double. It currently expends roughly 50 billion. All right. So Japan, if we double that, it would be around obviously 100 billion. That's not the case. I mean, it's not the Japanese government won't double defence spending. It will double security-related expenditures. So that includes, say, for instance, expenditure for the Coast Guard, expenditure for health and safety in terms of developing, physical infrastructure, etc. So there is as I said, there is a little bit of a misunderstanding. It's important to be clear about, what Japan intends to do and what it doesn't do. So yes, while the defence expenditure will increase significantly, we're not going to see a doubling of defence expenditure, which, for quite simply is very, very difficult from an economic perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. But, the reason I'm asking specifically around defense, but also, so it's not just defense that I'm talking about, because there's one big problem that you have also kind of alluded to in the book, is the Japanese grain population, right? So one of the most important premises in your book, and one of the reviews of the book, as it put it, is that you have brought a political scientist toolkit and a historian's craft to this very complicated topic, Yoshida Doctrine. And you spend a considerable part trying to embed the context and talked about the norm entrepreneurs who were important in shaping up the policy approach.
Sure.
But in Yoshida Doctrine, the most important thing was to grow as an economic power, right?
Yeah.
And Japan is steadily graying. So how do you do grand strategy as a graying power, considering that you don't want a lot of people to come in? Okay, there have been some lifting of migration, but even then, how do you do grand strategy in a continent which is relatively young and where you are still seen, and I mean Japan is still seen with some fear? So, okay, you want to partner with South Korea, but the South Koreans are also slightly susceptible to the general tradition of anti-Japanese sentiments. So what is the flux of the Japanese strategy, geopolitically, economically, and most importantly, demographically?
Yeah, we see you mentioned the Yoshida Doctrine, which was Japan's national, security strategy throughout the Cold War. And, there were two major tenets of that. And that was basically, as you mentioned, to focus national energies on economic growth and development. And second, to basically tie post-war security strategy, military strategy closely to the United States. So have the US come in and be essentially a security patron, all right? But what I argue in the book is that there is another element of this Yoshida Doctrine that tends to be implied more than it's stated explicitly, and that is that Japan, as a result of tying itself very closely to its main security benefactor, the United States, and focusing its national energies on economic growth and development, it therefore played a very low profile, had a very low-key role in international security affairs, had limits on its military roles and capabilities. And this, as I argued in the book, was sort of underpinned by this norm of anti-militarism. So this was the dominant strategy throughout the Cold War and into the very early post-Cold War years. And we've seen really over the last 2 decades, this transition to what is slowly becoming this, this Abe doctrine. So this Abe doctrine is not necessarily shifting the focus away from economic regeneration, because as all neo-realists will argue, that if you want to have a more robust military capability, you need to have a vibrant and robust economic capacity as well, or you'll end up something like, say, North Korea, So it's not as if Japan is completely moving away from, an economic focus. It's just that in the early sort of 1950s and throughout the 1960s, when this Yoshida doctrine was sort of first being enunciated, there was a greater need for Japan to embark upon the path of economic reconstruction for the simple reason and tragic reason that its economy had been destroyed, as a result of the Pacific War. So which made that push, all the more important, So if we fast forward to now, Japan has been, lots of commentators refer to these lost decades, First of all, it was a lost 1 decade, now 2 decades. Now, we're moving sort of into the third decades, and there is a sort of a strong, economic component to that. There was a bit of a jolt to the Japanese economy that was provided by, Abenomics. We had so greater fiscal expenditure, easing of monetary policy, attempts at structural reforms. So this has sort of been the major sort of differences, I would say, comparing, say, the period in which the earlier Yoshida doctrine was enunciated to the period, about 10 years ago when scholars sort of first started explicitly discussing an alternative security strategy. So economics is important, but perhaps slightly different reasons.
So now that we are talking about Yoshida doctrine, so it's time that we get back into the book. You try looking at the embedded norms of the Yoshida doctrine and then try and explaining the security regime of Japan. What I would now like to invite you to do is to share how Japan, which is a major economic power, but till Shinzo Abe goes to Washington, D.C. and gives a speech where he says that now it's a time, 1 year after he took over as the prime minister, that we have to become a tier 1 power. So how was the Japanese, for lack of a better word, secret service, spying capabilities, how were they organized? Because this is one of the most important things that you bring to the table in the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the basic puzzle that the book proposed was that Japan is an outlier, in terms of international intelligence. So compared to other middle powers, Japan has a relatively underdeveloped, and under-resourced intelligence apparatus. So if you look at the personnel who are part of the constituent agencies that make up Japan's intelligence community, they tend to be on the low side compared to a number of other powers in the international system. It receives less funding. All right, so that's one aspect where Japan is an outlier. But another, I argue, or another couple of other aspects is that, first of all, Japan doesn't have a foreign intelligence agency, its own version of the CIA or an MI6, for instance. Now, there were attempts to develop such an institution in the very early Cold War years, but for largely reasons related to this fear of, fear of a resurgence of militarist sentiments, which I dub anti-militarism. These attempts were thwarted. So that's another area where Japan is an outlier, for instance. My country, Australia, does have, through ASIS, does have a foreign intelligence capability. Lots of countries around the world have this capability. Japan doesn't. So the other two areas where Japan was an outlier, which, as we've sort of touched upon, Japan focused its post-war national energies on economic growth and development. So in that respect, we shouldn't be surprised that Japan's intelligence capabilities would be devoted to, trying to gain access to technological economic secrets, for instance. So that was another area where Japan differed from a number of other states. And the final one was there's firm civilian control over key intelligence capabilities. In particular, we have signals intelligence, where even though this was a military organization, this was essentially under the control of the Japanese police. All right. And finally, we had the foreign ministry being very influential over Japan's military attaches. So these are the areas that made Japan an international outlier in the world of intelligence. And my task in the book was to explain why is this the case. So I thought it was useful to sort of tie these Japan's activities, its institutions in the economic domain, and also the politico-military domain, to sort of tie these to the notion of grand strategy, the Yoshida Doctrine, and now this Abe Doctrine, and the norms that were embedded into it. So we had this internationally embedded norm of bilateralism, which is rooted, of course, in the security alliance with the United States. We had economically oriented norms such as developmentalism, this desire to catch up with the advanced industrialized powers, techno-nationalism, the idea that technology occupies a key role in national security, and also this norm, again, as I've mentioned, of anti-militarism, this fear or this resentment of the Japan's military establishment, and also opposition to its foreign deployment. So these were the norms that sort of shaped Japan's post-war intelligence apparatus and made it the outlier that it is. That's what I argue in the book.
So on page 104 of the book, there's a very interesting sort of extract of how the signal intelligence came to be. And
sure.
You kind of try and look at it from the perspective of bilateralism. And yet, in the book, throughout one of the undercurrents of the book is the CIA frustration with the Japanese side.
Yeah.
So would you like to, tell us a little bit more about it that you could perhaps not cover in the book?
Yeah, well, I mean, the frustration was that as Japan, it was under occupation, as from 1945 until it regained its sovereignty in April 1952. So the American intelligence services, and then after 47, when the CIA was established, were essentially, if not given carte blanche, they enjoyed a lot of freedoms, because Japan was under essentially US military rule, So they were given a lot of freedoms, and, to use Japan as a springboard for anti-communist intelligence operations. So, of course, when the occupation was sort of slowly winding down from, 1950, 1951, the Americans realized that they wouldn't be given the free hand to operate in Japan as they were during the occupation period. So they wanted to try to create a reliable liaison partner. So the CIA was active in trying to create, a counterpart organization in Japan. And this was, dubbed in Japan at the time as a Japanese style CIA. And, so that there were Japanese intelligence leaders who had been invited to the United States for discussions. US intelligence operatives had sort of provided models of what, a Japanese-style intelligence service might look like, from an organizational perspective. So there was considerable American input. But for the reasons that I mentioned related to anti-militarism, the Japanese were unable to sort of create this institution, this CIA type institution, that could sort of send spies abroad, so Japan has lacked this, much to the chagrin of the United States during this period.
And during all of this, there's also a very interesting outbreak. I mean, anti-militarism is very important, but while all of this is happening, and the growing, Japan is number one, Chalmers, Johnson, etc. They keep on talking about it. During all of this, there's an outburst periodically of either some, for lack of a better word, weird cult, which decides that the way to run Japan is through one of its philosophies, or the Japanese Red Army. And, all of this, planes get hijacked, terror events happen.
Yeah.
And as you said, that SIGINT was reporting to the police administration. It looks like a very interesting idea from an intelligence point of view, because intelligence officers in India also routinely come from the Indian police services, right? But in this context, the intelligence thing was not happening very well. So I have two questions here. A, what is the mechanism of giving feedback, if there is any? Second, who does this go to? Because the most important person by the looks of it is the prime minister, right? Because every other minister is, it is primus inter pares, but in this case, the prime minister is literally be all end all. So who is the liaison, the go-between? Because you don't have a spy chief. You don't have a person who is, I think the CIA calls intelligence product. So who is the one who's shaping this particular narrative?
Yeah, well, it's Japan's Cabinet Intelligence and Research Organization. So CIRO or CIRO, is the
but it's fragmented
English acronym. Well, the Japanese intelligence community, you could argue, is decentralized and fragmented. But this body, which, so if we can go back to what I was mentioning before, so there were frustrations, at Japan's inability to create a sort of CIA type organization. So what was established instead was CIRO. So CIRO was supposed to play this coordinating role. Coordinating, the intelligence activities, the intelligence product that the various agencies within the intelligence community collected, and passed these up to the, to the senior political leadership. But CIRO was unable to sort of play this liaison role, largely because of jurisdictional turf wars, which, bureaucratic politics, which is by no means unique to Japan. Lots of countries, have, government agencies who jealously guard their own turf. But what I argued is what made Japan sort of distinct is that, yes, there were, rational organizational interests that sort of drove a lot of these jurisdictional disputes, but there are also ideational concerns as well, again, rooted in these anti-militaristic fears. So CIRO was supposed to play this role. For these reasons, it was unable to. But if we fast forward to the last decade, CIRO's powers have been strengthened, so it has been able, or it has been more successful in its ability sort of to liaise and sort of centralise to a certain respect, the intelligence product that is collected from these disparate, members of the intelligence community. So there has been some progress in that respect. So this is just one part of, the former Prime Minister Abe's attempts to sort of centralise security policy decision making. So, we see this first and foremost with the establishment of a Security Council, National Security Council, NSC, which again was sort of modelled on this on the American equivalent.
So, since you brought up the Prime Minister, so there are two things in the strand in the book. One is Yoshida, and then Yoshida, and in the bookend is Abe, and in between you have the grand strategy. But one question that I had while I was going through the book was that there was a time when Japanese prime ministers would literally last months and be on the way out. So during this time, because the sense that one is getting that cabinet secretariat is the most important organization in Japan. How did this shape the Japanese exposure to the Chinese, who during this time, what you referred to earlier as the lost decades, China during these 3 lost decades has suddenly become the preeminent power, and there is now a tussle between Japan and China to be number one in that part of the world, the Indo-Pacific. So what has been the experience of security researchers looking at Japanese security strategy doctrine when there has been political instability, and some people are forecasting that perhaps the elections next year could throw up a surprise, So,
yeah, well, I mean, the period that you refer to, when there was quite a lot of turnover, really, in the prime ministership, it dates back to the Cold War period where, in many cases, the prime minister, as you said, they serve very short terms, and they're often sort of compromise candidates, and a part of the reason for this relates to the structure, the organizational structure of the LDP, Japan's, long-standing ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party, how it comprises, various factions, and these various factions, these political groupings were very influential, to the extent that the LDP has been described in the past as essentially a collective of political factions. So when the faction leaders were unable to, have their chosen candidate as the prime minister, they often had compromise candidates who were very, very weak and subsequently remained in office for a relatively short period of time. So, there were exceptions, during the Cold War years, throughout the post-Cold War years. We had Koizumi sort of buck this trend. He was in power for several years. Abe's first stint in power, he was a part of this sort of revolving door. He remained, his first stint in office only lasted 12 months. So he was one of 3 prime ministers that only remained in power for 1 year. But what Koizumi did, and Abe very much sort of continued with these reforms, was to try to centralise decision-making authority in the prime minister, in the prime minister's office, to give the prime minister more power. And so as I said, Abe continued with these policies. So when, during his second term in office from 2012, which sort of contributed, a contributing factor to him being ultimately Japan's longest serving prime minister. So, so Abe has used this sort of more centralised authority to usher in a whole range of security reforms, creating new institutions, etc., passing new security-related legislation, which has, allowed Japan to sort of slowly build up its military capabilities, etc., under the rubric of this sort of shifting national security strategy, the Abe Doctrine. And a lot of this is designed to counteract what you mentioned is the rise of China. China is more assertive externally, and a lot of these China's assertiveness, directly affects Japan's own security interests. So a lot of these reforms have been undertaken with an eye to counteracting the Japanese threat. But I want to mention also that these security, reforms, which are significant, have really been taken in very close coordination with the United States. So some people think that Japan desires to become a more autonomous actor in international security affairs. This is not the case. These reforms, institutional reforms, these growing capabilities have been very much undertaken with an eye to how they can help Japan be a more reliable ally of the United States, instead of the free-riding ally that Japan was characterized as being, during the Cold War.
Right. Since you mentioned Junichiro Koizumi, who is a very interesting figure in all of this, I think his visit to the Yasukuni Shrine.
Yeah, Yasukuni Shrine, yes.
And, that was a very calculated move to get I would not say the Chinese riled up. They must have their own reasons for it. But there is a very interesting historian of China, Inder Mitra, who has written a terrific book called China's Greatest War. It's about the Second World War and China.
Yeah.
And that's a call to arm for the Chinese Communist Party, has always been. It's this great beacon. So how do you see the Japanese, I can't ask you to mind read, but can I ask you to let us illuminate this for us? What was going on in the head? Because at one time you want to create a coherent foreign policy, but this seems like a very fragmented approach and a very fractious one to take to a country next to you, which gets riled up by this. And not just China, it's also South Korea.
Yes.
It's also North Korea. And it's also this great fear of the return of the Japanese strongmen.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so if we look at the key components of this new Abe Doctrine, one of the aspects is historical revisionism. So when Japanese politicians, visit the Yasukuni Shrine, this has many Chinese and many Koreans arguing that, a Japan that is unrepentant about what it did in the past is likely to commit the same mistakes in the future. All right. And this is a perspective that I disagree with, but it's not productive diplomatically. Koizumi knew that visiting the shrine would cause problems with Japan's immediate neighbours. It's been argued, again, you sort of touched upon this need to sort of, to do it for domestic political reasons. That's not an argument that I buy. Koizumi was strong enough that he didn't need to, visit the shrine. Abe didn't need to visit the shrine as well, because his nationalist credentials in particular are strong. So it just, unnecessarily upsets the Chinese. But from an American perspective, so yes, these visits upset the Chinese, but they also make things difficult for America, in terms of presenting a unified front, having its major East Asian allies in Japan and South Korea, having them work together alongside the United States to help, curb these aggressive tendencies from the Chinese and the North Koreans, well, and also Russia as well. So it makes, US strategy in the region much more difficult when its two major East Asian allies are not getting on. So the US also during this period, 2013, 2014, were also very upset at, Abe's historical revisionism. And when the US Secretary of State and Defense Secretary visited Japan, they made a very pointed gesture in actually visiting an alternative war memorial, the Chidori Gafuchi War Memorial, to sort of send a very sort of, direct message that, you can pray for your war dead. You have a memorial that you can do so without upsetting your neighbors, and it doesn't have to be Yasukuni.
Right. So in all of this, when your book is coming to its conclusion, very interestingly, because till now you've been talking about how the United States has been playing the role earlier as a mentor in defining strategy, security, alliances, and then slowly and steadily as an equal partner, right? But then you have the espionage cases. And one of the very critical organizations that you did not bring up in that intelligence complex is the MITI, the Ministry for Internal Trade. And, and how they keep on playing this. And they are, going by Japanologists, I don't know if that's a word now, but,
Japanologists.
Okay. So Chalmers Johnson, Ezra Vogel, I have that red book that came out a few decades ago. Japan is number one. So there was this. So there was this attempt at saying that this body, MITI, is one of the most important institutions in Japan, and then we have these espionage cases that you talk about. Could you take us through that? What happened between this bilateral relationship that it soured suddenly?
Yeah, well, the interesting aspect of this is that Japan, again, and this is tied to grand, the notion of grand strategy, is that Japan, on the one hand, was and is a very close political and military ally of the United States. But in the economic domain, it saw itself very much as a competitor. Japan was not unique in this respect. America's other allies and strategic partners, so Taiwan, previously South Korea, Israel as well, France, all saw themselves as allies, politico-military allies, but also economic competitors. So, Peter Schweitzer wrote a very interesting book in the 1990s called Friendly Spies. So, a friendly spy is one who you cooperate with, from a US perspective, who you cooperate with in the politico-military domain. But, you were targeted by these countries' economic intelligence agencies. So that was interesting as well. So that was another aspect that I sort of looked at as well. And, during the Cold War, the US wasn't oblivious to these, activities, its allies, trying to gain access to American commercial and technological secrets, etc. But during the Cold War, the big focus, of course, was communists, communism, and first and foremost, Soviet activities, espionage activities in the United States, and also Chinese activities. So these were the main focus of America's counterintelligence agencies. So, unless the activities of its Asian allies became sort of too open and, too in your face, then the American counterintelligence agencies tended to not worry about them so much, because Cold War politics dictated that the key focus was on communist espionage activity. So, of course, with the demise of the Cold War And throughout the 1990s, the demise, the subsequent demise of the communist threat, America became much more sensitive to these types of activities on the part of its of its military allies.
So one of the main pillars of partnership between Japan and the United States currently is what I call the chip business. And I mean, you would be aware about it, but in 1990s, the Japanese industries were eclipsing the United States supremacy in the area. And so the Americans went around, very steadily dismantling the Japanese chip industry by, letting in newer players like TSMC in Taiwan and others in South Korea come up. And now we see the same bit. I mean, this year we have had 3 or 4 lists that have come out from the US. The latest one has just come out last week. What does it say about, amnesia or institutional amnesia in this case? Because the Japanese are now suddenly being asked to give TSMC a corridor so that they can get back to, creating new chips.
Yeah.
How does it feature in with this idea of grand strategy? Because this is more like an American grand strategy and not really a Japanese grand strategy.
Well, no, I would argue that, again, I mentioned earlier this norm of techno-nationalism, the idea that technology occupies a central place in security policy formulation. So these chips, are the lifeblood of modern technology, of modern economies. So, the fact that Japan let its domestic chip industry sort of lag behind, certainly its Taiwanese counterpart, certainly challenges this idea, and Japan and the United States are in very much are sort of trying to play catch up. They're worried about China's technological advances in this area, and of course, they're all trying to court Taiwan. The Japanese prefecture of Kumamoto in southwestern Japan is going to host a TSMC facility. So the idea is to, I guess, try to alleviate the risk to chip supplies, should, China invade in Taiwan, thereby, imperiling chip supplies, Taiwanese chip supplies.
So what I really want to kind of bring in here is the role that there are certain interesting politicians in Japan. Ichiro Ozawa, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is a very interesting politician because I hope it would not be offensive to him. He is seen as a power broker in Japan.
Yeah,
and he's
not anymore. Not anymore.
Not anymore. But
not
he's
anymore.
been seen as a power broker.
He was, yes.
And, he's this instrumental in Japanese nationalism coming to the fore. So, how do you see any hope, any possibility that the Japanese and the Chinese are going to come together at any point of time?
No, not at all.
Right. That's an equivocal no.
No. I mean, no, it'd be unimaginable.
Right.
I mean, their value systems are completely different, So, so again, going back to the Abe doctrine. So I mentioned the idea of historical revisionism, security revisionism becoming key components, but also Japan reaching out to like-minded democracies. So India has occupied a key role in this. Japan's economic and security ties with India have grown, significantly over the past decade. They've grown significantly in relation to Australia as well. So, Japan is a democracy, clearly, unmistakably a democracy. Japanese people enjoy enormous civil and political liberties. So in terms of value systems, it's unimaginable that we could see Japan, for instance, abrogating its alliance with the United States and joining up with China. Of course, this is not to stop Japan from having, close, consultative relations, cooperating in areas where it can. One area where I think, Japan could be more proactive is in green technology. China is very advanced in terms of developing, technologies such as, solar panels, etc. If we look at electric automobiles, so these are areas where I think there is plenty of opportunity for both countries to cooperate. So you can cooperate with countries that you might describe or define as being, say, strategic competitors. But the idea that Japan would somehow move away from the American security orbit and into China's, I think, is very far-fetched.
Right.
10, probably 15 years ago, or a little more, there were some arguing that South Korea was doing this, during the early noughties when South Korea was under progressive rule under, Kim Dae-jung and then Roh Moo-hyun. There were some analysts were arguing, sort of looking at the growing economic and strategic relationship between South Korea and China, that South Korea was slowly moving away from the United States, because it had some security issues, some security problems with the United States. Anti-Americanism was growing in South Korea. So, as I said, there were some analysts that were arguing that South Korea was moving slowly away from America to having a closer relationship with China, which was an argument that I never really bought into. And of course, if you look now, South Korea has been moving away from China, like Japan, diversifying its supply chains, etc., moving closer to the United States in security relations. So, South Korea, again, another vibrant and robust democracy. So again, it would be unimaginable under current circumstances to envisage, these countries moving away from America and becoming, allies of the United States.
Right. So I've got a final academic answer and a non-academic answer for that, which brings me to, interestingly, everybody in Japan, outside Japan, has been asking Japan to take a position in the Middle East conflict, because Japan has a huge influence in that part of the world. And you've worked on countries like Myanmar, and this is very interesting that in Asia, the Japanese influence is relatively, let's say, obscured than, say, the ostensible Chinese influence. How did this bridge come to be, that Japan has a huge influence in Middle East, which China now wants to get into, but in, say, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, this influence has been not that great? Is it just because of the Second World War?
Well, no, I would argue that Japan's, economic influence has been very strong, throughout the Cold War period. So, Japan started redeveloping, its economic ties with the countries of the Asia Pacific region, Southeast Asia in particular, from the 1950s on, because of obviously historical sensitivities, these relations focused on the economic domain. So there was, enormous Japanese investment. The countries of Southeast Asia were sort of tied into Japanese production network. So there was a very strong Japanese, sort of trade and investment relationship with the countries of Southeast Asia. This has been, overshadowed in recent times by the China's Belt and Road initiative. But there's a lot of fanfare about BRI. A lot of attention focuses on this, but I think a lot of it is overblown. We do have countries, while on the one hand, they're very eager to court Chinese investment for obvious reasons, they're worried about some of the negative consequences of receiving that investment, such as being indebted to China, having a lot of Chinese labourers come in and working on these projects, taking jobs from the local workforce, etc. So I would argue that Japan has always had a very strong economic role in Southeast Asia. In terms of the Middle East, Japan has tried to present itself as somewhat of a neutral broker. Again, very closely tied to the United States, of course, so it's sensitive to American interests in the Middle East, but also because Japan gets most of its energy resources from the Middle East, that it also has needed to tread a very delicate line to be, this on the one hand to be sensitive to American concerns, but also to Arab concerns. Lest that the Arab oil producing countries, cut back on their oil supplies to Japan. So it has been a very sort of difficult sort of, tightrope, if you will, that the Japanese have tried to walk there. But if you look at in the most recent, with the current conflict involving Hamas, you don't really hear much about Japan's role at all, and it seems to be China that expectations seem to be centering on to play a greater role in trying to prevent the region from spiraling into a large-scale military conflict.
Right. That is true. But I think a lot of people expect Japan to play a much more important role, primarily because from the China side, the fear is that you never know if the person leading the negotiation might just not one fine day disappear. That seems to be happening. It's the norm these days in Beijing.
Sure.
People just... But that brings me to kind of a close to this before I open it up to my colleagues who might have questions. I mean, I can go on and on. The book is very interesting. But I'm going to now set you up to do a bit of crystal ball gazing. What do you see as the foreign policy of Japan in the Asian century? Because one of the accusations often lobbied or levied on Japan is that it does not really have a coherent foreign policy. This is not me. These are American think tanks that have written very gleefully about it, and also that the Abe doctrine is largely an updation of the Yoshida doctrine, but you kind of dismantle that in your book. So a bit of crystal gazing.
Yeah, it's been argued that Japan in the past didn't have a grand strategy, which is a view that, say, Richard Samuels from MIT and I and a number of other Japan specialists, did agree with. It did have a grand strategy, although that grand strategy looked different from the major powers. The Yoshida doctrine, because of its strong economic emphasis, did look a little different from the grand strategies of the other major or the great powers in the international system. I would see, in terms of looking into the future, and I always tell my students, never make predictions because we just simply don't know what's going to happen. But you've asked me, so I'll offer a very cautious estimate of what might happen, and I would argue that we'll see Japan continue along its current strategy, under this Abe doctrine. So again, reaching out to continuing to develop relationships with like-minded democracies. So we'll see growing ties with, India, Australia, South Korea as well, and also continuing the very close and intimate security relationship with the United States. Of course, we're going to see Japan playing a more prominent role in international security affairs. This is not going to be an autonomous role. This will be a role that will be undertaken closely in coordination with the United States. So that's the type of Japan that I would envisage, in the short to medium term. Very much a continuation of trends that have become sort of more prominent over the past decade or so.
Thank you for that. Now, with your permission, and I hope you have time, right?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so with that, I'll open it up to my colleagues who might have a question. Please go ahead. Okay, I have one while they get warmed up. I have a question from a member of our board. And the question is that Japan has played an important role in setting up of multilateral institutions such as the ADB, but it has taken a step back now from its it's not really part or party of any large multilateral things such as the BRI that have come up.
So such as the what, sorry?
The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative,
yes,
etc.
Yeah.
And it's also taking a very cautious approach to, apart from Quad, it's not really getting itself aligned to any institution out there. And even in the ADB, it's taking a step back. So what could be the reason for it?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that analysis. Japan, along with the United States, are the key players, in the Asian Development Bank. As you point out, Japan is not a member of the BRI, but largely for political reasons, but has agreed to cooperate in areas where it can with China. That might not necessarily be under the banner of the BRI, but in terms of other multilateral efforts, Japan has been very active in terms of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Treaty for, what is it now? The CPTPP.
The Trans-Pacific.
Exactly, and has been very eager to try to get the US to play a more active role in this. America, of course, stepped back. One of the first things that Trump did when he became president. So, as I said, I wouldn't say Japan is necessarily sort of stepping back. It's just that its activities, I think, tend to get overshadowed by a lot of the hubris that's associated with the BRI, I think.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer some pertinent, some impertinent, some not so important questions about Japan. Thank you very much for doing it.
Thank you very much for the questions. They were all very interesting, and I hope I answered them.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Okay, enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Professor Williams, and thank you, Professor Rai, for the session today. And thank you to everyone for listening and asking the questions. See you soon. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.